formato que estamos siguiendo en estas sesiones, en la mayoría de ellas, es dedicar la primera parte de la sesión a una breve introducción de lo que es el tema, el área funcional, que encontrarán ustedes dentro del DIMBOK. Ya todos saben qué es el DIMBOK, ¿verdad? El Data Management Body of Knowledge está allá afuera. Por aquí alguien ya nos puede enseñar cuál es el DIMBOK. Y bueno, lo que vamos a hacer es simplemente dar una introducción breve. Y en este tema me acompaña Federico Genoese de ABInito, quien nos estará platicando de ya un enfoque mucho más práctico de los temas relacionados con metadatos. Entonces, para poder arrancar, no tengo mucho tiempo, tengo 10 minutos para dar la introducción, pero lo primero que quisiera es preguntarles: ¿quiénes de ustedes saben en este momento en dónde se encuentran escrituras de su casa, departamento? Los demás no tienen no, pues, departamento. ¿O no saben dónde están? En el archivo del banco, pero saben dónde está. Es fundamental que sepamos dónde se encuentran nuestros activos, ¿no? Que nos cuesta mucho trabajo. A algunas personas a lo mejor no, pero a los que estamos aquí, a la mayoría, yo creo que nos cuesta mucho trabajo conseguir nuestros activos. Y los cuidamos mucho y sabemos dónde están. Bueno, los datos, ya hemos platicado en alguna otra de las intervenciones, que son un activo estratégico en cualquier organización. Entonces, como activo estratégico deberíamos de saber dónde están y saber todo de ellos. Entonces, eso está muy relacionado con los metadatos. En esta breve introducción estaremos hablando de más o menos qué son los metadatos. ¿Alguien tiene idea de qué son los metadatos? Que no sean los expositores. Bueno, ojalá que sí. ¿Sí? Este tema de metadatos no es nuevo, data de hace muchísimos años. Surge con las bibliotecas y con la intención de apoyar a la organización de todo el acervo en una biblioteca. Y hay varias definiciones, ¿no? DAMA mismo tiene su definición. Y yo siempre termino, después de repasar todas las definiciones, termino compartiendo mi propia definición, que los metadatos es todo lo que usted quería saber de los datos menos el dato mismo. Pero ¿por qué queremos saber todo acerca de los datos? ¿Cuánto tiempo invierten, ojalá invirtieran, gastan en buscar información y no la encuentran? Desde un correo, ¿no? Déjame ahorita te doy el correo que acabo seguro lo encuentro y pasa mucho tiempo. Más otra información más relevante dentro de las organizaciones y que no encontramos cuando la necesitamos, ¿no? Se hizo un estudio, la organización International Data Corporation hizo un estudio para cuantificar el costo de no encontrar los datos, ¿no? Dice, bueno, tomaron 15, dicen que 15% de los trabajadores dedican el 35% de la muestra que sacaron, hicieron una muestra sobre 1,000 trabajadores y dijeron de esos 1,000 trabajadores, 15% dedican el 35% de su tiempo a buscar información y de esos el 40% no encuentran la información que buscan, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, que el costo entre considerar lo que ganan entonces las personas que tomaron en esa muestra, pues al final se arrojaba que era un total de 31 millones de dólares al año por esas personas que no encuentran, están trabajando buscando algo que no encuentran. Entonces, teniendo eso como marco, y ahora ya podemos pasar a lo que son los metadatos, ¿no? Ya les decía yo, son todo lo que usted quiere saber sobre el dato, menos el dato mismo. Pero un ejemplo así muy trivial para explicarle a los niños Cuando nos dicen, ¿y ustedes a qué se dedican? Mis hijos siempre me preguntan, ¿tú qué haces, mamá? Pues yo juego con los datos. ¿Qué es eso de cuando hice mi primer repositorio de metadatos? ¿Y qué es eso? Pues mira, es como cuando tú ves una fotografía y toda la descripción que tienes de la fotografía, de los píxeles, de la calidad de la luz y demás. Todo eso me está describiendo la fotografía, menos lo que hay en la fotografía. Entonces, eso son los metadatos. Todo lo que necesitas saber alrededor del dato, menos la imagen del video, ¿no? Menos el dato, ¿no? Entonces, a mí se me hizo así como algo, una manera fácil de explicar qué es esto de los metadatos. Entonces, dentro de Teambook, el Data Management Body of Knowledge, uno de los capítulos, una de las áreas funcionales es la de la gestión de metadatos, ¿no? En esta hay 10 áreas funcionales y bueno, el tema de metadatos está presente, venía ya presente desde la edición anterior y es fundamental. Hablábamos también de la necesidad de poder valorar a nuestros datos, de convertirlos expresarlos de una manera en términos económicos. La manera de hacerlo es, primero tenemos que saber dónde están nuestros datos, qué son nuestros datos, y todo lo que podamos expresar alrededor de los datos, incluyendo la calidad, el nivel de calidad de los datos, también son metadatos, y también nos sirven para poder llegar a expresar de manera tangible y transformarlo en términos económicos el valor de nuestros datos. En el Teambook, desde la versión 1, pero ahora con un poco de evolución en la edición 2, tenemos un mapa de contexto. Todas las áreas funcionales van a tener un mapa de contexto en donde vamos a poder encontrar desde la definición del área funcional, las metas que buscamos con esa área funcional, las actividades, la parte central es esencial, son las actividades que tenemos que llevar a cabo. El Teambook no nos va a dar una receta, no nos va a decir exactamente cómo hacer las cosas, porque eso dependerá pues, de las tecnologías, de las plataformas tecnológicas que queramos usar y que más nos convengan de acuerdo a las características de nuestra organización. Pero lo importante es que sí contemos con todas esas actividades, ¿no? Entonces, para aquellos de ustedes que no conocen el Teambook, un poco para darles la estructura, siempre todo el mapa de contexto va a traer al centro las actividades, va a traer las entradas, quienes nos están suministrando esas entradas, nos va a decir cuáles son los entregables que tenemos que estar generando y va a estar soportado por lo que son técnicas, herramientas y métricas. Si seguimos todo este contexto, podremos tener la seguridad de que estaremos tomando en cuenta todos los aspectos fundamentales para poder llevar a cabo alguna de las prácticas que están contenidas acá. Específicamente, ya para el tema de metadatos, pues las actividades fundamentales son el definir la estrategia de metadatos que queremos seguir. Y eso tiene que ver con identificar todas las fuentes de metadatos que podamos tener en la organización, entendiendo desde luego que los metadatos no son exclusivamente de tecnología. La mayoría de la gente siempre, cuando hablo de metadatos, me dicen, sí, la definición de las tablas, de los campos, ¿no? Hay muchísimo tipo de metadatos. Todo lo que podamos pensar que nos pueda describir un dato, desde un concepto, por ejemplo, ¿qué es un cliente? ¿Qué es un cliente activo? Eso es un concepto que después no puedo yo ligar hacia un dato físico que se encuentra en un lugar particular, eso es otra cosa. Pero tenemos que identificar los distintos tipos de metadatos que podamos tener. La siguiente actividad es entender los requerimientos de los metadatos. ¿Por qué los queremos? ¿Qué les queremos hacer? ¿Para qué nos van a servir? Entonces, todo esto nos va a llevar a poder definir la arquitectura de metadatos que vamos a tener, ¿no? Dependiendo de las fuentes de donde lo queremos tener. Muchas veces, por ejemplo, el manejar, en el sector financiero manejamos mucha entrega de reportes regulatorios y en ocasiones no se sabe ese reporte regulatorio a quién se le entrega, con qué datos se genera, quién es el responsable de entregarlo, etcétera. Todo eso es información alrededor de un reporte que se convierte en metadatos, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, tenemos la definición de la arquitectura de metadatos. Y bueno, dentro de las actividades tenemos actividades de planeación, tenemos actividades de operación y tenemos actividades de control, ¿no? O sea, se cubre todo el ciclo de vida de lo que son los procesos que se tienen que llevar a cabo para la práctica. Aquí algo importante, por ejemplo, es en las técnicas que están soportando todas esas actividades. Bueno, en la última actividad tenemos consulta, reporte y análisis de metadatos. Algo fundamental en los metadatos es que se podrían utilizar. Entonces es importante que la metadata esté accesible a todo aquel que lo requiera, ¿no? Y bueno, por ejemplo, en las técnicas tenemos el linaje de datos. Ahorita les voy a presentar un ejemplo de linaje de datos que a mí me encanta, porque es lo que es un tipo de metadato, pero es lo que nos permite conocer qué pasa con el dato, dónde nace, cómo todo el ciclo de vida, dónde nace, por dónde pasa, quién lo utiliza, cómo se transforma y hasta dónde llega. Herramientas. En las herramientas fundamentales cuando hablamos de metadatos son el repositorio de metadatos, ¿no? Entonces, eso es lo medular que ustedes tendrán que buscar cuando hagan su organización o su planeación de gestión de metadatos. Y bueno, mi introducción, mi tiempo de introducción está terminado. Parte del material lo van a poder ver ustedes, donde, por ejemplo, en la siguiente vamos a hablar de los distintos tipos de metadatos. Un ejemplo que les quería yo compartir de linaje, que es uno de los muchos tipos de metadatos que existen, en donde ustedes pueden llegar a ver, incluso dependiendo de la plataforma tecnológica que utilizan, pueden llegar a ver gráficamente su linaje. Y bueno, ¿por qué lo necesitamos? Pues para poder tener el archivo donde pueden tener la gaveta donde van a tener toda su información. Y bueno, pues con esto terminaría yo la introducción. Al final vamos a tener una sección de preguntas para que podamos tratar de resolver aquellas dudas que puedan tener, pero a fin de que no nos alarguemos del tiempo que tenemos establecido y que puedan ustedes seguir a la siguiente intervención, a la siguiente presentación, pues le paso la estafeta ahora a Federico para que nos platique.
Muchas gracias, Marilu. Y lo siento mucho, pero el español es mi tercer idioma, entonces voy a terminar la presentación en inglés. My name is Federico Genoese. I'm a strategy consultant at ABInito, and through my work, both at ABInito and before joining ABInito, I was for many years at Capital One, which is a top 10 U.S. bank, and I was responsible for enterprise information management as well as the risk office. I've been involved in data governance projects and metadata projects. In fact, I've been working in the space for more than 15 years. And even when I was at Capital One, I was a ABInito customer and spent a lot of time working on the harvesting and the collection of metadata. So over the years, I've learned a lot of things about these projects, and what I would like to do is talk a little bit about some of the important characteristics of a metadata project in order to make sure that it's successful. Some different approaches to running metadata projects, both an overall flow with steps that we've identified can make a project successful, but also some different ways of structuring the project that may be different depending on the kind of company that you have. And then last but not least, I want to speak a little bit about data quality. And over the course of the conference, especially yesterday, I attended a number of the workshops. There's a lot of discussion of data quality, and I have a slightly different perspective than some of those that I've heard in the conference so far, and I want to share them with you. And maybe you will agree with me, maybe not, but I think it's a useful perspective to have. So let's start right away. The first thing I want to mention is that metadata has to really be meaningful to the company. A lot of I've seen a few situations where companies get very excited about data governance and they want to roll out a data governance project and collect a lot of metadata. But unless there's value in it, those projects very often die. So it's really important to understand which metadata you want to collect and why. So let's look at the first view is why data, and I think that people in this conference understand that data can be used for many different purposes, both to improve the company's performance as well as to protect a specific company. It's really important to understand when you have a data project, what is the objective that I'm trying to reach with this particular data project? And then over time, your data governance for your data will grow and will encompass more areas. But every time, you can focus on a specific category of value that you want to bring for the company. So we've identified 4 major characteristics of data that are really important to make data valuable to a company. Data has to be in the right form at the right time. It has to be affordable, available to collect metadata. And we organize metadata in a very similar way, or the categories are very similar to the ones that are found in the DM box that Marilu presented. But everything that has to do with data is a metadata. So everything from data security to architecture, audit trails, models, quality is all data that provides information about your data and is therefore metadata. But which ones you need for any given project will depend on the specific business objective you're trying to reach. So the first suggestion I would make is if you're starting a metadata project, don't try to collect all the metadata right away. Choose what is really meaningful to you, begin with that, and then over time, your metadata repository will grow and will have more kinds. Now, the other thing that I would caution everybody against is that manual processes are very limited. I've worked with a few customers around the world, some very large banks, who said, we want to collect metadata, we want to have a place where we collect metadata, and we're going to hire people to harvest metadata, and we're going to put it in spreadsheets. And the reality is that this becomes very unwieldy very, very quickly. And not only is it unwieldy, but it's very error prone. So some of the customers I mentioned that started with the idea of building a metadata repository using manual processes and putting things in spreadsheet, not only found that there were errors in the metadata, but they discovered that the regulators had a real problem with the fact that there were errors in the metadata. And this became apparent when financial services companies had to prove to regulators that their risk reports were correct. And in order to prove that risk reports were correct, they had to have lineage. And if the lineage was generated manually, it was very difficult to demonstrate to the regulator that it was correct, and therefore that the risk reports were accurate. So absolutely maximize the harvest of metadata. You will build a metadata repository. Over time, you will put different kinds of metadata within it. But as much as possible, use automated importers to harvest the metadata and create automated feeds for the metadata. These can be everything from your source code. Source code can be parsed, and that can be driving what is the lineage of your data. So you can see how data is processed by different systems by looking at source code. You can load models, data models from your data modeling system. You can import existing metadata that you might have in other places already in your companies and integrate it. It's important to have a single place that becomes the system of record for metadata, but that can be a place that aggregates things that you may already have. Next.
And then once you have your metadata consolidated in a single repository, it's really important to identify in detail how you're going to govern the metadata. And there can be different kinds of metadata that you're governing. And for each kind, you can have different kinds of controls. And for the controls, you need to have a technology support to make sure that the attestations and the validations and the controls are adequate. And for, let me ask a question. How many people here work in highly regulated industries like banking or telecommunications? So for those of you who work in those industries, you're very familiar with the concept of controls. And this is no different. It's in project. And it's really important to follow them in sequence to make sure that you are performing the overall end-to-end scope of your project in a positive and productive way. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to understand companies in Europe that are now subject to a new regulation for data security called GDPR. And interestingly, a lot of these companies don't even know what data they have. So the metadata they need to generate is sensitive data definitions, but they don't know what they have in their system. So the first step is to identify what data you have. And you can use a lot of different techniques to do that, including profiling, including data discovery, and try to find information about your data from your stores and document that and put that in your repository. The second thing you need to do is to really understand the overall scope of your data. So do the validation of your data, understand what errors there might be in the data. And as I said, I'll talk a little bit more about data quality, but the first step in data quality is not correcting data, it's knowing the quality of your data. And once you know it, you can decide what to do about it and how to manage it. The third thing you need to do is understand the overall transparency of the data, build the end-to-end lineage, understand where your data comes from, as Marilu stated, and where it goes and why, and how it is all integrated in an overall environment and framework. Then the next step is putting the controls in place. So I mentioned it's really important to have controls for the metadata so you can attest that it's correct. This needs to be delegated to people. There have to be stewards. Now there can be different ways of structuring the controls, but they must be documented, they must be clear, and then you must assign the right people in order to be able to maintain your metadata. A lot of metadata projects fail because the metadata is imported, it's harvested, a metadata repository is created, but then the ongoing processes for maintaining are not in place, and the metadata becomes stale. So having the right processes in place, having accountability for people to maintain metadata, and identifying who those are is an essential part of the overall metadata management, and it must be integrated in the workflows that are part of the repository so that it can be all worked in a single place. Metadata is not just data that is business that is business information about your data. There are also, as Marilu presented, there's technical metadata, there's operational metadata. It is really important that this all be captured and controlled in order to be able to provide information about SLAs, to provide information about the meeting operational metrics, making sure that the right teams are receiving the data at the right time, so have processing information. There's a very important regulation for banks regarding risk reporting. And risk reports must be prepared every single day or on whatever the schedule is for the bank, not only in normal times when everything is going well, but also in times of stress, when credit or liquidity or market risk are spiking. Banks need to be able to continue to produce these reports on the SLA even when they're under stress and the volumes are higher. Well, one of the challenges is understanding how you build individual SLAs of each step in the chain to make sure that the end-to-end can actually meet the SLA. And one of the problems that companies sometimes find is that at times of stress, all systems slow down. But each individual system remains within the SLA, but when all the systems are at the maximum SLA, the final result is not a timely report. And by having the right operational lineage as well as functional lineage, you can identify the critical path and make sure that your SLAs are adequate. Last but not least, metadata has to be available. You have to be able to look at the reports, to understand how the reports fit together, how the contents of your metadata repository translates into things that are actionable, things that you can do. So if you have data quality rule results, you know what your data quality is. Can you translate that into the potential risk to your company? If you're a bank and your credit risk data has a certain percentage of error, you can probably figure out what your exposure is because it creates a discrepancy between your actual position and the position that you should have. All of these need to be reviewed so that you can take actionable steps on your data on the basis of the information that your metadata is telling you. So the question is, once you have these different blocks that you need to put in place to build your metadata project, what are the right deployment models for these types of programs and what's best? And that depends on your organization. So one of the most common models is a top-down model. And this is a kind of model that is that starts at the very top. You have a business strategy, and then from the business strategy, you go all the way down at the capillary level to what every individual in the organization must do to make your metadata project successful. This normally, this is employed in a lot of different companies, and sometimes it's very successful and sometimes it's not. And it's useful to look at the parameters that can predict whether this approach can be successful or not in your company.
But that's the strategy for the data, for the metadata. I don't understand.
So the data strategy includes the metadata strategy, because you cannot have a data strategy, in my opinion, without also having a strategy for governing the data. To govern the data, you must have metadata. So in my opinion, anytime you have a data project, you have to be thinking, how do I govern it? What metadata do I collect? So I think all of this flows from it. And I think in the next slide I will show you an example that will make sense. Here we talk about, for instance, design automated and manual processes to implement level 3 process. What does that mean? Well, one of the really important things that you have to do is define the processes for managing your data and for managing your metadata. And a common error is to keep those at a very high level rather than going down to the detail. This is an example of a process flow that we suggested to one of our customers for harvesting lineage from their sources. And harvesting lineage is one of those things that you don't do only once. You do over time and you expand over time. But every time you do it, you should have a repeatable way where you know who does what, when, and in what sequence. And there can be decisions that you take along the way where, for instance, if certain conditions are met, you follow this flow. Other conditions are met, you follow this flow, and then re-enter the flow. So it's really important to get into the detail. And this is one of those cases where investing time early in the project and identifying how you want to run your metadata governance will predict the success that you will have. And this is particularly true in a top-down process, because in a top-down process you must specify what you will do, whereas in a bottoms-up process that I will look at later, you can employ a more agile way of working because you have a smaller team and you can refine the processes in a very agile way. So what are the, how do I assess overall the top-down approach? It's very effective in organizations that are centralized and have the patience, because these top-down projects can take a very long time. It also requires significant change management. The organization has to be ready to change, and it requires executive sponsorship. I mentioned that I worked at Capital One, and when I was at Capital One in 2002, a long time ago, we received a notification from the Office of Thrift Supervision that our data governance was insufficient compared to the risk that we were taking. And this was published, and our stock plummeted within 24 hours. So we had to put data governance in place. We had to build metadata. We had to build a metadata repository. And it was not something that could be delegated to individual units. So the head of the bank declared that we would build data governance and hired a chief data officer who drove it and worked with me, and we put this in place. And it was not an optional thing for the bank. It was survival for the bank, and that's why it started from the top, and it had a very strong executive sponsorship. The other thing I would say is that you have to know the culture of the bank, because this is a quote I like: culture eats top-down for breakfast, culture eats implementation for breakfast. If the culture of your organization is not supportive of a top-down approach, it can really cause a failure of the project. I know I've worked with one of our clients who's a very, very large bank, global bank, but they have very loose top control. So the head of the bank is the headquarters is in the UK, but each individual country around the world operates as an independent bank, very loosely coordinated. A top-down approach in that culture, where the individual parts of the bank work independently, would almost certainly fail. The other thing about top-down is that it's expensive. You're not investing in just one little bit of metadata. You are affecting the entire organization. So you have to have the executive drive to be able to do it. Capital One had no choice. Our sources of funding were drying up. We had to do it to survive. There was no choice, and we did it. Finally, if you do follow all these steps and you do a top-down project, generally the end result is very positive, and it has a tendency to stay. And the reason it has a tendency to stay is because it changed the culture of the organization. It was really started from the top and permeated the entire organization, and therefore everybody changes the way they work, and they embrace metadata as a way of governing data and as a way of working together. The other way you can work is bottoms up. So you start from a part of the organization that has a data problem, and they want to govern it, and they want to harvest metadata about it. So they identify the critical data associated with it, they measure the quality, they go through the full life cycle, and they refine it over time. And then a successful local metadata implementation serves as a template that other units within the organization can learn from, and then over time the repository of metadata grows, and over time the organization embraces metadata in order to support their data governance. Now, the positives and negatives of a bottoms-up approach are somewhat different, opposite to the ones from top-down, not surprisingly. So the first one is you get immediate rapid results. It's instant gratification. You can start with something very small, and you can start it at a division level and really make a difference very quickly. This can build momentum, because when one unit is successful and another unit looks at it, they want to do it also. And so it can really help to make success in companies where the culture would not support an overall data governance change. It can be started with a very small budget. You don't have to commit a very large portion of your company's funds in order to be able to do it. It's not all or nothing. It's the opposite. It can generate significant rework. Now, if you work in IT and you've read the Agile Manifesto, you will look at this and you will say, sure, but rework is good. That's one of the items in the Agile Manifesto. Rework is good, but it also costs money. So it has to be a trade-off that your organization is willing to do. And in the interest of doing an Agile implementation, that can be something you do. And obviously, if you have a ton of rework, the end cost, if you do end up doing the entire organization, could be quite high. In fact, higher than if you've done it top-down. but depending on your culture and your organization, top-down may not be a right approach. It may also never finish, because you could start from the bottom and you could have 75% of your organization doing metadata and the last 25 thinking, I don't need that, I don't want that, and I'm glad you 75% of the company are happy, but that's not something we may want to do. This can be okay, because metadata projects should be driven by business needs, but it's something that you need to trade off when you're considering this approach. And then the benefits may be very transient if it hasn't entrenched itself. So if you do a metadata project in a division and it's successful, but the management of the division changes, there's a shift in focus, there hasn't been that deep change in corporate culture that embraced data governance and metadata governance, and so the advantages and the wins may be fleeting. So I will close by talking a little bit about data quality. And as I said, I've heard a lot about data quality in some of the conference conversations that I've had, and I have a slightly different perspective on it. So I want to put a somewhat provocative idea out there, and the provocative idea is that all data is good. So when people start thinking about building a data lake or a data repository, they think the data repository should be beautiful. All the data should be clean, it should be accurate, it should be perfect. But when they actually build a data lake, what they generally find is that it looks more like this. And then everybody says, oh, this is terrible. The data is not clean, I have data quality problems, I can't use it. And I look at this, and I worked in a company, Capital One, that was a data-driven company, and I look at this and I think, this is beautiful. It's not necessarily beautiful for everything, but it's beautiful for a lot of things. And I will give you an example where I worked on a project where bad data was actually fantastic data. So I worked in we were trying to build a predictive model to identify customer prospects that would be good customers for wealth management. As a bank, we wanted to offer wealth management. So we wanted to identify people who had a lot of money. And we made a partnership with an insurance company that had many different brokers. And the brokers sold insurance to the customers and collected information about the customers. And this information we thought could be useful for identifying potential wealth management customers. And we found that the date of birth of the customers, in a lot of cases, was 9/9/1999. And my son was actually born in 9/9/1999, but he's unusual. Most people are not. And so everybody said, these birthdays, they're all wrong. We have to cleanse them. But then one of the statisticians said, hang on, that may not be true. And he did a regression on the data and discovered that actually 9/9/99 correlated with very high-value customers. So the model was using that data and was making a good prediction on it. Then we asked the question, why? How does this happen? And what we discovered is that there were some brokers who dealt with high-value customers who were always in a hurry, who were entering the data, and they discovered that there was no check on the data entry system to just enter 9/9/999, and they could get through the application process much more quickly. Their customers were happier, and these tended to be higher-value customers. So this is an example where the data is wrong, but it's also a proxy for something you want to measure and very predictive. So, next slide. The point I want to make is that data should not necessarily be right, it needs to be fit for purpose. Right? And so, as I said, there is no bad data. All data provides information. You might not hit with the 999 example, but even if the data is wrong and bad, don't just fix it, because maybe it points to a process problem that you need to fix instead of the data. Next. So the data, and sometimes data looks wrong, but it actually isn't. So if somebody were trying to cleanse people's birth dates and they ran into my son, who was actually born on 9/9/99, they would potentially breaking it, and therefore you should you should be careful about cleansing data, and you should never cleanse raw data because raw data contains insights. That said, you should always be profiling your data, and you should measure and assess its quality so you know what you have. Once you know what you have, you can decide what to do with it. And at that point, you can actually create different repositories of data for different purposes. And that takes me to the final picture, which is go ahead and have your data, and you should always keep your data as is. If you've worked in an organization with statisticians, with data scientists who want to be able to do things like multivariable polynomial predictive algorithms, they want to work with everything that came out because that has the most insights. Whenever you clean something, you lose insights. Now, you should still clean things because you can't tell a regulator that you've created a risk report with bad data. So you need to make sure that you have curated data that's fit for purpose for things like risk, regulatory reporting, etc. But you have to have both. So what I would end with is data quality is great. It's really important to know what your data quality is on your systems, but be very careful about having the urge and the impulse to want to have pristine data because you will probably lose information when you clean it. So thank you. I think that my time is about right.